Hi all, I just wanted to give you a couple little quick tips in regards to toning your images in Lightroom. And quite honestly, unless you really need to dive into some nitty-gritty detail and really work on specifics, I think Lightroom's a perfectly fine place to tone your images with basically the same results as Photoshop. Photoshop just gives you more specific tools to get into the nitty-gritty. So here we are on the image that I'm going to guess maybe somewhere in a big city like New York. And the first thing that I want to do is color correct it because I can see that it's quite yellow, a little bit has a little green tone hinge to it. So in Lightroom, I'm in the development module, and you can see that we have the eyedropper here. Now the eyedropper in Lightroom will basically adjust to your grays or your blacks, whatever you choose as your target. And so I don't really see a white again that I really love, so I'm gonna use the back of this chair as my neutral and use that to sample from. I think that did a pretty good job. However, I do see that it has a little bit of magenta in the gray. So what I can do a little bit more easily here without going through a bunch of different menus is make that adjustment up here in where you see tint and temperature. And you can see that it's quite a bit into the magenta. So I'm just going to pull it a little bit more into the green, being really careful not to go too far either way. So that's about right where I like it, and I am eyeballing it, and a lot of what we do is by eyeball. Now if you're really a technical person, you can type the number in that you want it to go to, and you can be as specific as you like. A lot of what we see though in photographers is really adjusting to our eyes. And I think this looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and be okay with it. Now if I want to dodge or burn in Lightroom, it's a little bit more, it can, well, let's say not as specific. For me, I find it a little bit more cumbersome, but what I can do is grab this brush here and click on it. Now I have some presets in my own personal Lightroom that I've added, but you can check in here under Effect and look and see what you have, and most likely you have these basic options up here to set to. So I'm going to say that I want to open up a little bit of the shadows in the face of this kind of gentleman just to make it pop a little bit. Now with Lightroom you can also adjust using those brackets, and in theory I should really make this image a little bit bigger so I'm more targeted with what I'm doing. I'm adjusting the shadow, so the first thing that I'm going to do is just kind of paint in where I want that to happen, and you'll see it turns a little red there. Now I can be more specific with what I'm doing by opening up, and I just want to open up that exposure a little bit there, and that's looking pretty good. I don't want to go hog wild. Now one of the things with Lightroom is you have to remember to put your tools back in the toolbox. So I can see my tool is still out by this little dot here, and I'm going to go back into my brush tool and put that away. Now I can see exactly what the adjustments are. Now if I don't put the tool away, then I'll start adjusting a bunch of different things. So it didn't make a huge difference, but it is a little bit of a pop. Now I can see over here too, I've got some things going on with the reflection here. Now this, maybe if I decide to darken this a little bit, it'll be more noticeable. So I'm going to grab that tool, and I'm still in shadows, but I think I want to be more in the highlights because it's bright, right? And I'm going to paint a little bit over this gentleman here. And I can see where I'm going because it's a little bit red, and I'm going to darken that a little bit. And I really can't tell fully until I put that tool back, so let's go ahead and put that back, and we can see it darkened it up a little bit. Now if we go out, you can see it's a little bit more noticeable. So very subtle change. It's easy to do in both Lightroom and Photoshop. Just depends on what you feel most comfortable with. Now looking at this image of the barn, I know that one of the things that really drives me crazy is how tilted the horizon line is. And I talked about this in the Photoshop um, tutorial that is the companion to this. Now first I'm going to see if I can work on the exposure a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and hit auto and see if that makes any adjustment. Whoa, yeah, it sure did, and way too much. So I know that was in the exposure department, so I'm going to start to bring that back down to a place I like, right? I can't really tell exactly what I need it to be because I wasn't there. I wasn't the photographer. And I'm not really sure what the goal of the photo was. But I know that the horizon line is really annoying, right? So I know also that by hitting the R on Lightroom, in Lightroom I should say, will bring up the crop tool. So I've hit R, I've got my crop tool border, and I can see that I need to come in a little bit and give this whole framing a little bit of space so that I can correct that horizon line, and I can get my little kind of wiggly tool down there and manually start to adjust to try to figure out how do I make this look more level. Now that by my eye looks pretty good, but I can also take this level tool here, click that, and draw a line from one end to the other and see what it thinks is the most level. And you saw that adjustment, and that's what Lightroom is suggesting will be the most level in regards to this picture. So I'm going to go ahead and hit return, and that looks a lot better. Now I still think that there's not much detail in this foreground, so I'm going to open up the shadows a little bit and give it a little bit more detail. I have to be careful not to lighten it too much. So I just start experimenting with the different aspects of what I am trying to achieve. I need to have a goal in mind for that and work from there. Now, in regard to the color, I'm not entirely sure what it should look like, as I said, but I'm going to go ahead and pick that tool, and I'm going to guess that my target neutral is the top of this roof. It looks like a really good gray to sample from. And it did a nice job. It, to me, again, seems a little bit magenta. So I'm going to put back a little bit of green into it, and it also changed my exposure, and I'm going to adjust that. Now I think it could be a little bit brighter in terms of contrast, so I'm going to adjust that a little bit. And I'd like it to be a little bit more saturated. It just seems flat to me. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a pump, and you can see that the greens are being well, saturated, right? So I think this is as good as it's going to get without totally changing the images, and I'm going to say that's okay. Just a few little tips on these images specifically for this class. Play around with your own images as much as you possibly can, and really have goals for what you want to do with your images and what they should look like. Best for this class to stick to reality as much as possible. We aren't going to be playing with those creative filters in this course.